What's up, guys? It's your boy, History of Football, and today we're talking about the history of US presidents. Yeah, I guess I'm branching out a bit. But anyway, here we are. We're doing a US president tier list. Before I jump into it, let me go through a few things. I'm not doing all the presidents. I'm doing 16 out of 45. There's way too fucking many. You're not going to watch a 45-minute video, and neither am I. I'm doing the ones that I think are most significant or most interesting, or ones I particularly like or dislike. I'm also going to try to focus just on their presidency. What they did in their personal life, what they did before being a president or after being a president is not relevant. I'm just talking about what they did as a president. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, first up is George W. Bush, George Bush Jr. This is in no particular order. I've just uploaded the files, and this is how they've come in, so we're going to roll with that. Okay, so I do remember George W. Bush. He was the president when I was a teenager. He was the president when 9/11 happened. Also, the global financial crisis. He's not responsible for either of those things. 9/11 would have happened regardless. GFC would have happened regardless. It's really a stretch to blame that on him. Very likable guy. You can argue how relevant that is for a president. One thing I do like is he passed legislation to protect babies that survived abortion, so late-stage abortions. Occasionally the baby survives, and there was a grey area around what to do with the baby. Do you kill it? Do you just leave it to die? Or do you try to save it? He put in legislation that made it black and white clear. You have to save it. Regardless of where you sit on the abortion topic, I think we can all agree that babies outside of the womb should be saved. I hope we can agree on that. Okay, let's get into the real stuff now. When we talk about George W. Bush, we're always going to talk about Afghanistan War and Iraq War. My opinion on the Afghanistan war is that it had to happen. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, they did 9/11. If you think that was an inside job, you're an idiot. So I think Afghanistan had to happen. The Taliban were hiding Osama bin Laden. They wouldn't turn him over. He simply had to go in. Anyone would have done it. Now, Afghanistan went on far too long. This is presidents after him as well. I don't think you can blame that solely on him. So I think Afghanistan was fine. Iraq, on the other hand, was a huge mess. Whether you think they deliberately lied or it was bad intel, the invasion of Iraq made no sense. Saddam Hussein, terrible dictator, no question, but is it really America's problem to be fixing? I don't think so. They say 1 million people died in the Iraq war, directly or indirectly. And as we all know, it was based on faulty intelligence that they were participating in the 9/11 planning and had weapons of mass destruction, whatever that means. I think Iraq war is a huge blight on George W. Bush, and I think that pulls him down from a B to a C. Yep. Next we have Bill Clinton. I actually quite like Bill Clinton. He might be the best president of my lifetime. Very moderate for a Democrat by today's standards. I think if he was still in politics now, he would not be considered as the Democrat nominee because he's just too moderate. He might be the last fiscal conservative. He even achieved budget surpluses in his final years in office, which is sort of unheard now. No one even seems to care about balancing the budget, so I do like that. He was also tough on immigration. He recognized that it did take away certain jobs of US citizens, so he was tough on immigration. Illegal immigrants were turned back. He also helped to broker the Oslo Accords, which of course was an agreement between Israel and Palestine. We can debate about whether we like those accords or not and which side they favored, but I think any diplomacy between those two warring states, if you want to call them that, is a step in the right direction. And last thing on Bill Clinton, he put in place welfare reforms, which is one of the ways he achieved a budget surplus. Essentially made it harder for unemployed people to just receive Social Security year after year after year. After several years, they essentially forced you to back into the workplace if you were able to do so. And also people that have newly migrated to the United States, there was a 5-year period where you couldn't receive Social Security. It removes that incentive for people to come to the US just to get a handout. It's all very common sense in my opinion, and I quite like it. So I reckon he's a B. I think he's a fine president. Okay, next is Andrew Jackson. Most of you probably don't recognize his face here, but that's Andrew Jackson. I really hate this guy, but I do have to admit he did some good. So he was known as fighting for the common man. He fought against the elites and the bankers. Before he came along, really only the elites could vote, people that owned land, etc. So he formed the Democrat Party, and he made it so that white men, essentially all white men, could vote. Women couldn't vote, not even a chance. If you weren't white, if you were Indian or black, forget about it. He didn't give a shit. He owned slaves. He was unapologetic. He was a racist Southern Democrat. He was very critical of abolitionists, people that wanted to end slavery. He was quoted as saying they are monsters that deserve to die. Probably the thing that he's most known for in a negative way was the Indian Removal Act. Essentially, he wanted to expand the United States. There was farmland they needed, but Native Americans were there, various tribes. So he would make treaties with them, which essentially amounted to, hey, we need this farmland. We've arranged for some other land for you over on the west side of the Mississippi. We'll sort of give you some help to get over there, and you'll be on your way. Some of the tribes agreed to it, and I'm more or less okay with that. Some of them did not agree to it, and they were sort of tricked, pressured, coerced, or forced into it. And there was a lot of bloodshed. There was something called the Trail of Tears. A ton of Indians died either in war or just physically in the process of moving to their new land. It was a pretty awful time. What else can we say about Andrew Jackson? He's also known for ignoring the Supreme Court. Supreme Court had made a ruling on a unimportant, boring matter, and he had scoffed at it, saying, blah, 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 they've made a ruling, let's see them enforce it. So that was pretty full on. So you can see I've got mixed emotions on this guy. Yes, he did expand voting rights to essentially all white men, but yeah, ignoring the Supreme Court, kicking the Indians off their land. Yeah, it's hard to like this guy. Interestingly, Andrew Jackson is Trump's favorite president, and he absolutely has raved about him at times. If I could ask Trump one question, it would be, why is Andrew Jackson your favorite president? Because I'd genuinely love to know. One good thing that we do need to say about Andrew Jackson was that he managed to pay off the US national debt, which is something that no president has managed to achieve since then. So that's definitely a positive. But look, there's just so many negatives on this guy. I realize he was competent in several or many ways, but I just think he was such a bastard. He's gone squarely in D tier. Okay, moving on to Barack Obama. We all know this guy, very recent president. I happen to think he's wildly overrated. I think people that love him love his rhetoric, the way he speaks, and admittedly that is an important part of the job. You could argue that a big part of a president's job is being the spokesman for the United States, an inspiration for the world, a unifier. He speaks extremely well, and you do need to rate him highly for that. I think his policies were largely uneventful. Let's go through them. Obamacare, I don't mind. I'm not a massive fan of it, but I think it makes sense. It was reasonable. It was a measured step towards a single-payer medical system. I think it was fine. The Iran nuclear deal, I think, was too soft. Long story short, it allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium, which to me is just mind-boggling. I mean, what's the freaking point of the deal? You're making a soft-ass deal with the devil. So I'm not a huge fan of his Iran nuclear deal, to be honest. Another thing I don't love about him is he actually turned out to be a divisive president, not a unifying president. When he came to the office, I think he was fine. Towards the end of his second term, he would fan the flames of racism, essentially bringing up racism and discrimination and oppression constantly. I'll put an image up on the screen showing racial sort of tensions over time, and they did dip during his term, which is really the opposite of what you might have thought or what you expected to happen. So I don't love him for that. I want to put him low, but I need to be objective, and he wasn't terrible. I just think he's overrated. So I'm going to put him in the B tier, but in my opinion, he's definitely below a Clinton, and pretty lucky to hang on to B tier, in my opinion. Okay, next we have the first of the Roosevelts. This is Teddy Roosevelt. I think everyone on both sides of the aisle likes this guy. It's hard to find anyone that doesn't like him, to be honest. He seemed like a pretty sick lad, to be honest. So what did he do? He helped the creation of the Panama Canal. That's huge. He helped set up national parks. Who doesn't like that? He put forward the Square Deal, which among other things essentially involved breaking up large corporations that had developed monopolies, like on the railway. I'm mostly a free market proponent, but I think breaking up corporations that have just become a monopoly, which is actually quite rare, we can debate that if you like, but in the event that it does happen, and I think it had happened in those instances, I think he did the right thing in breaking them up. And he also put together the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which we just take for granted now. When you go to the shop and buy a packet of chips, you just know that food's going to be safe, unless you're a schizo that thinks food is poison or something. But he put that in place. I give him huge credit. I think he's a solid A. I can't think of any reason to mark him down. Okay, next we have this gentleman here, Woodrow Wilson. Here's my least favorite president, and I think without question the worst human being to ever become the US president. This guy was incredibly racist even for his time. He was president after slavery had ended, but his family had owned slaves. He expressed no sympathy or remorse for that whatsoever. Racist Southern Democrat. Prior to becoming a president, sorry, I knew I wasn't going to focus on before becoming a president, but I'm just going to tell you why I hate this guy so much. He was a professor, and he was the head of Princeton University, and he essentially refused to take any black people in university. He was obsessed with eugenics. He wanted to breed Down syndrome people out of the population. The Nazis were heavily inspired by that, and they took it to the next level. So I absolutely hate this guy. He screened a film called Birth of a Nation in the White House, notorious for portraying African Americans as like basically savages. It was incredible. A lot of the actors were just white people with like black face paint. It was incredibly ridiculous, and he's quoted as saying that the film was historically accurate. So I'm a pretty horrendous person. I need to be objective though, and he did do some things that were good or were at least okay. He did remove tariffs and replace it with an income tax. He does cop a lot of flack for bringing in the income tax, but in my opinion, if it's replacing tariffs, then I think an income tax is better than a tariff. There's a myth that he was the first person to bring in the income tax. He actually wasn't. Abraham Lincoln was the first to bring in an income tax, which was only temporary during the Civil War, but nevertheless, he still did that. Another positive I need to give him credit for, it was during his term that women were allowed to vote, but it's important to remember that it wasn't really a big issue to him. There was pressure for him to allow women to vote, and he never really seemed it as a priority. He focused on other things, and it was only towards the end of his term that he finally allowed it to happen. So I'll give him credit for doing it, but let's not act like it was his like signature issue or something. He was also criticized for World War I. When he went for re-election, he promised that he wouldn't get America involved in World War I. After being re-elected, he then got America involved in World War I. I don't have a particularly strong view on whether they should or should not have gone into World War I, but it does seem clear that he lied about that. One last thing on him, he's also credited for establishing the Federal Reserve, the central bank, which is hugely controversial. Some people think it's an abomination, some people think it's fine. That's a very deep topic. I'm still undecided on that one. I'm not necessarily marking him down for that. But I think I've told you enough to understand why he's the worst of the worst, absolute bottom of D tier. Next we have George Washington, the first president. When the United States was founded, he was voted the president overwhelmingly. he ended up defining so much of what it means to be a president. For example, they didn't know what to call him. Do you want to be Your Highness, Your Majesty, etc., etc.? Very humble man. He just said, "Call me Mr. President," and that continues to this day. He also set the precedent of stepping down after 2 terms. He could have stayed president for life. He could have been dictator, wildly popular. But I think the humbleness he had to step down, it set the mold for how the nation would govern for the next few hundred years up until now, really. He did own slaves. That does eat away at me. I get the argument that he was a man of his times, but I think even back then, I know back then, there was controversy around it, and it's not like they were oblivious to the moral issues with that. So yeah, my take is that he could have released his slaves at any point, but he didn't. So that does eat away at me, but I think we can't ignore that he is an S tier. Oh, and one more thing to say about George Washington. He was one of 3 presidents to donate their salary. 3 being George Washington, JFK, and Donald Trump. So obviously the 3 most integral men in history refused their salary and decided to donate it to charity. And let me also say, I'm only ranking him as a president. I realize he was a general before becoming a president. That's not relevant in my score. And in fact, I think he was actually a pretty lousy general, but that's irrelevant. Next, we have Biden. I actually think he would have been a good president if he'd been president even 10 years earlier. I think by the time he became president, he was basically a senile old man that was just pushed around and taken advantage of. Obviously, in his old senile state, he came across as quite weak. There was a few wars that started during his term. You have the Ukraine war and then the fire up in the Israel situation. I think it's reasonable to think that his perceived weakness could have been a factor in those sparking up. I understand you could never prove what would have happened if someone else was in office, so I could be wrong on that. In the last day of his presidency, he pardoned his son, Hunter Biden, which I think is just pure black and white corruption. So that's not fantastic. He also had a shocking record on the border, essentially allowed in millions of illegal immigrants to enter the nation and stay there. And that's one of the main reasons that basically Trump won in 2024, because the border was such a disaster for them. He's also blamed for inflation. I'm not so clear on that. I think inflation's always multifactorial. It's not clear how much of that can be put on the president. To a degree, it was his bad luck that it happened. Was he able to fix it? Not really, not soon enough. But I think he's a little bit hard done by on that topic. And the last thing I'll say on Biden is that he was one of the worst proponents of DEI, which is a very controversial one, but I'll tell you how I see it. I think it's a mistake to overcorrect for discrimination in the past. For example, he nominated Kamala Harris as his vice president because she was a black woman. And he appointed Justice Jackson on the Supreme Court because she was a black woman. I'm not speculating. That's literally what he said. So yeah, overcorrecting for the past, I don't think is the correct way to do it. Some people see it differently, and that's fine. I think it was a negative. All in all, he's going in the D tier. I do feel conflicted. As I said, I think if he was 10 years younger, I think he'd be higher. I think his intentions were a lot better, but at the end of the day, you're just an old senile man, and it wasn't great. I think he's going in the D tier. I do put him above these other 2 characters. Okay, next we have FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. I think this guy is highly overrated. He's generally credited with getting the United States out of the Great Depression. The contrarian argument is that he extended the Depression. I'm somewhere in the middle. I like some of the policies in the New Deal. Some of them I don't like. I won't go into it as it'll take a long time to go through. But I think he's highly overrated, and I think US would have come out of the Great Depression anyway. I don't think he helped the situation. What I do like about him, I do like his leadership. I like his fireside chats. Go listen to one of his fireside chats. It's pretty good stuff. I respect that he would try things, and if they didn't work, he would try something else. I respect that humility, but at the end of the day, I think the things he tried weren't that fantastic. He also led the US into World War II. He's generally viewed favorably. He had to increase the top marginal tax rate up to 94% to fund World War II, and also the US debt ballooned 10 times. Multiplied 10 times during his presidency, which is pretty nuts. I know there was a Great Depression and a World War II to fund, but it's hard to look upon that favorably. Some things I really don't like about him: he refused to take Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, which is pretty unthinkable. Also during World War II, they went around and locked up US citizens of Japanese descent, and they just locked them up in concentration camps because they thought they might be spies. I understand the temperature at the time, but gee, you just can't be doing that. A couple more things to say on FDR. I don't really have a problem with him governing for 4 terms, totaling 12 years. George Washington had set the precedent that you serve 2 terms and then step down. There was actually no law forbidding him from going for longer. I actually don't have any problem with him doing that. I have a larger problem with him trying to reform the Supreme Court. So at the time, the Supreme Court had blocked some of his legislation as unconstitutional, and he wanted to reform the Supreme Court, which involved adding more members to the Supreme Court. He was obviously trying to choose who those members would be, ones that are favorable to him. So that to me is actually more reprehensible from him. So yeah, a lot to say about him. Most people love him. Most people put him in the top 3. It's usually Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. I think that's ridiculous. I'm not saying he's terrible, but he's well overrated. I'm going to put him in B, and to be honest, he's probably lucky to hang on to B. Okay, next we have JFK. I'm a big fan of JFK. Who doesn't like him? He was charismatic. He donated his salary to charity. I think the fact that he was assassinated, obviously people will sympathize with that and like him even more. But I think there's plenty to like about him regardless. He's a very moderate Democrat. I think if he was around today, I do think he could potentially be a Republican. I think the Democrat Party would shun him as being too moderate. His greatest achievement was obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the world has ever come to nuclear warfare. It was under a lot of pressure to attack the Soviets, to attack Cuba. He held out and he didn't do that, and yeah, managed to de-escalate. So yeah, it's hard to not like that. That's pretty courageous stuff. So mad respect to that. He also put forward tax cuts. They actually were passed after he passed away. Lyndon Johnson got them through, but I still give the credit to JFK because it was what he proposed. They were effective in creating jobs and stimulating the economy. Most people think tax cuts bring about a deficit, but they don't actually have to, because if it spurs activity, you can actually get the same amount of tax revenue, and that's what you saw with these tax cuts, and that's what you see with most tax cuts. So I think he's a solid. A. Leadership in the Cuban Missile Crisis, tax cuts, charisma, shot in the head. What's not to like about the guy? Okay, moving on to my favorite president, Abraham Lincoln. This is the guy that fought the Civil War against the southern states, the southern slave-holding states. He won that war. He kept the Union together. He ended slavery, Emancipation Proclamation, etc., etc. This is the guy that ended slavery. Yeah, you could argue that it was going to happen anyway, but he's the guy that did it. And yeah, he was assassinated for that. That's the reason he was killed. People have critiqued the fact that 700,000 died in the Civil War and that he could have avoided or minimized those deaths. I don't really see it that way. I think he was on the good side, and I think the bad side is responsible for all the deaths. Maybe that's a simplistic take. Tell me if you disagree with that. But I just don't hold that against him. I think he ended slavery, and he's a freaking champion. He is my favorite, right at the top. Did he do other shit? No one knows. No one cares. He's the best. Okay, Nixon. This one's a controversial one. Okay, so where do we start with him? Obviously, we all know about Watergate. Pretty shocking stuff. I've heard it said that he just needed to apologize and come clean, and he would have been fine. I don't see it that way. I think Watergate pretty much ends your career, full stop. I think that alone, you've got to mark him down into either the C or the D category. Also criticized for involvement in Vietnam. He promised to get the troops out of Vietnam, and he did do that eventually. It took a lot longer than he could have. He was doing secret bombings in Vietnam and Cambodia. Killed about 100,000 civilians. It's been said that this somehow formed the creation of the Khmer Rouge. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I'm not jumping to that conclusion. The other thing that comes to mind with Nixon is coming off the Bretton Woods, essentially the gold standard. This was called the Nixon shock, where he put in place short-term wage and price freezes as well as tariffs. This was considered a political success at the time, but long-term it's viewed as an economic failure. It's quite complicated. I don't know for sure that he caused the inflation and the recession that followed, but I do know that if you're doing price controls and tariffs, I'm going to need a very good explanation as to why you did that. So yeah, I don't see much argument that he was a good president. It's more just degrees of like how terrible do you think he is. I understand he put in place the EPA, environmental protections, and he obviously had achievements, and he was a bright dude, but just his character enough is pretty poor. I'm going to put him in the C category, well behind George Bush. I can't put him down in D. I just can't. I mean, you could argue that Obama should swap with him, and some of you will, and that's fine. Yeah, I just can't put him down in this category. Okay, here's an interesting one. Jimmy Carter. Most people consider him to be a poor president, but a terrific human being. I think he's actually highly overrated as a human being. A lot of the philanthropic stuff he did after being a president didn't really impress me, but we won't go into that. So as a president, there's a few things. He inherited inflation, and he wasn't able to fix it in his term. That's a tough one, man. Inflation's a real prick to fix. And in some ways, it was just his bad luck that he came into office when there was inflation around. Yeah, sure, he couldn't fix it. Would I have been able to fix it? I'm not so sure. Inflation's a real prick, I'm afraid. One thing he did was the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. Long story short, it led to the Egypt-Israel peace agreement the following year, in which Israel gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in exchange for peace. And that set the trend for all of the most of the surrounding Arab states to recognize Israel and make peace with them. So, got to give Jimmy Carter credit for that. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, brokering that peace deal between Israel and Egypt somewhat contributed to the Iran hostage crisis, which was a real plague on Jimmy Carter's presidency. So, briefly, the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran in 1979. The government was taken over by religious maniacs. They immediately started chanting "Death to Israel, death to America." If I was the US president, I would have been fairly suspicious of that, and you wouldn't be saying "Death to America" for very long. I can tell you that. Anyway, getting back to the story, there were some US diplomats in Iran, and Iran took them hostage. Jimmy Carter was not able to get them back. They ended up being released on Ronald Reagan's first day in office. So that remains a definite blight on Jimmy Carter's presidency. Difficult situation. It's hard to know exactly how to deal with that situation, but generally I think US has been too soft on Iran, and then 45 years onwards from that point, they continue to be a menace in the region, and they still are. So yeah, Jimmy, probably a little bit soft on that issue. I'm putting him in the C tier. I can't quite put him down in D because I think he did some good, and I also think he had some pretty bad luck in terms of the problems that he had to deal with. Okay, Ronald Reagan. This one's a very controversial one. I know that you know this person, and I know you have an opinion on him. I think Ronald Reagan was hard done by the media. He was obviously a legitimate Hollywood star before getting into politics. The media dubbed his economic ideas as Reaganomics. they ignored the fact that he actually has an economics degree and was extremely eloquent at explaining his positions. Other opponents will say, oh, trickle-down economics doesn't work. Trickle-down economics doesn't exist. Reagan never used those terms. No economist has ever used those terms. It's actually just a straw man argument. At best, it's a disingenuous summary of how supply-side economics works. Now, don't get me wrong, there's definitely valid criticisms to be made against supply-side economics. I do understand the people that view him less favorably. I personally don't have a problem with it. I think he mostly did good, created jobs, created growth. The tax cuts mostly paid for themselves. There wasn't a huge deficit. The actual deficit in his presidency, he tripled the debt. That was because of spending. The federal debt is overwhelmingly a spending issue, not a taxing issue. So yeah, he spent a ton on military, building up the military, which is obviously an important thing. Yeah, huge tax cuts. We're talking about the top marginal tax rate coming down from 70 down to 50, and then he later reduced it again to 40 or 39. I don't think anyone should be paying 70% tax, so bringing it from 70 down to 50, I think I'm on board with that. As I said, it did spur the economy. There wasn't really a reduction in tax revenue, so it's a bit of a fallacy to think that was the case. He also sacked federal workers that went on strike, which I think is the correct way to deal with people that strike. It's not always practical to sack them, but I think where it is practical, I think it is the right way to go. He also removed some regulation, which I think is generally the right direction to head in. So I'm fairly positive on him. Very charismatic, obviously. Negatives, he didn't handle the AIDS crisis well. I think that's fair to say. I'm putting him up in the A tier. This A tier is in no particular order. I don't have a strong view on which of those I prefer. Mostly positive on Reagan. Understand some people may see it differently. I'm keen to hear what you think I've missed. Okay, we're nearly done here, guys. This person here is Harry Truman. He is most known for dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. Hugely controversial decision. I happen to think it was the right one. Those bloody Japs deserved it. Did I just say that? Better edit that one out. No, seriously though, very high stakes position he was in. All things considered, I think he made the right decision. It arguably saved Japanese lives in the end, and it sure as hell saved American lives. So yeah, I do stand by that. Now, after World War II, it turned out the Soviets actually weren't the good guys. And the Soviets were developing a hydrogen bomb much more powerful than the atomic bomb that was used in Japan. Truman made the decision that the US would also develop a hydrogen bomb to keep up. So you could see how this could potentially ramp up into a very hectic situation. Now, the US were involved in the Korean War, which was the South Koreans fighting against the communist North Koreans, backed by China, yada, yada, yada. Truman was under pressure to use nuclear weapons in that conflict. And he made the decision not to because it would escalate into a bigger war. So I have a ton of respect for this guy that he decided to use the weapons on Japan because the circumstances were appropriate, then decided not to use it in the Korean War. So I have a ton of respect for this guy for the level-headedness and the temperament that he showed in these incredibly high-stakes situations. What else can we say about him? He ended segregation in the army, so essentially black and white people allowed to fight together. He did this even though it angered the racist Southern Democrat members of his party. This guy was a Democrat. He did the right thing. He didn't care about the backlash. He also supported the creation of Israel. Most of you think that USA has always backed Israel. That's not the case. He was under pressure to actually back the surrounding Arab states because the USA wanted access to their oil. He didn't care. He did the right thing. He backed the creation of Israel, which is undoubtedly the right thing. On the domestic front, he sort of continued FDR's policies. A lot of it didn't go through. There were some little things that went through, but nothing minor. So I don't really give a lot of weighting to that. It was really his foreign policy is what I think about in terms of his presidency. Okay, so where am I ranking this guy? This is a red hot take, but I'm putting him up in the S tier. Put him up in the S tier. You haven't seen that one before, do you? I just like everything about this guy. Moral clarity, temperament. I think he's in the S tier. He's one of my favorite presidents. I mean, George Washington had slaves, for God's sake. You're not arguing about that. So yeah, he's my S tier. If you don't like it, go make your own list. Okay, now the last one is Donald Trump. I almost wasn't going to do him because he's actually a sitting president, and I'm more interested in the history. I'm not trying to do a running commentary of current events, so I'm not going to say too much about him. I think a lot of people would put him in the D category just based off all the unhinged shit that he writes on the internet, on Twitter, some of the things he said in interviews. I definitely hear you, particularly like denying the 2020 election was really quite awful. And I think based on that, his ceiling is really a B. Like S and A is out of the question, and it's really like, is he a B, a C, or a D? I happen to like some of his policies a lot, and I happen to dislike some of his policies a lot. I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to put him in the C. I just think it's too early. I think there's time for him to move up to a B or down to a D. I think we actually need to wait for his second term to finish before we can really say. You've got to let some of these things play out. And I don't think I can approach this in an unbiased way, and I don't think any of you can either. So I'm going to put him in C with a large asterisk that we need to wait for his second presidency to finish. But I hear you. His rhetoric is quite awful. I think if he was president like 20 years ago before smartphones, I think we would have a completely different opinion on him, because you just wouldn't see all of this nonsense he puts on the internet. You'd more judge him on his policies, which are sometimes good, sometimes bad, but they generally do reflect the will of the American people, and that's democracy for you. So we'll leave it there, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave a comment if you think I made any outrageous errors, then please let me know. All right, I'll chat to you soon. Ciao.